Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's edition of Faith to Faith. We've been following the theme of education, the methodology of education within the Abrahamic faiths in particular, and in more detail, the Abrahamic faiths according to the prophetic traditions. Last week we dealt in depth with education perspectives from various angles. We're going to continue that theme today with my very learned guest, Sayyid Muhammad Taqi Rizvi, who's one of the principal movers and shakers within the Islamic College in London. Welcome to the show, Maulana.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Lovely to have you on board. Today's topic is a follow-on to a series of discussions that we've been having around Islamic education, prophetic traditions around education, and the methodologies in particular. We tend to be overwhelmed by secular methodologies quite often. Is there really a difference, first of all, between prophetic methodology of teaching and some of the secular traditions that you've seen? Before we come on to our particular focus today, which is going to be on Surah Jummah as a template or almost a toolkit for the way education ought to be done. First of all, is there a difference between secular education methodology and that instituted by the prophetic traditions?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think when we talk about the imparting of knowledge in education, what's really similar, and obviously in any system, is that one is trying to convert what one understands to be an element of unknown in the person in front, in other the recipient. The giver has to have the tools by which he can change the unknown to a known. In others, there are concepts which the giver has, where the recipient feels he needs to have them to increase his or her knowledge. So that in itself is a common cause, and that is that they want to impart known to that person, the individual who has the unknown. But it's really understanding, first of all, the components of that information, because sometimes you get there's a lot of discussions in Islam is how do you impart everything as knowledge, or knowledge itself has that which is useful and not useful. There's a lot of discussion in that as well, that when somebody learns something, is he or she learning things which are going to be useful for that individual's future, or they're just going to be a load of information? Yes, of course, gaining information is not an issue, but is it time wasted in gaining that information? Because in any type of logical development of an individual, one endeavors to make sure that one doesn't lose time in one's life. Time management is essential. Islam creates the whole process of time management. When Islam says wake up in the morning to pray, stop everything and go for Zohar to pray, it's all time management. And the whole purpose of time management is to make sure that you don't waste time. in education, it's very important that those who are giving knowledge give that which will not waste an individual in acquiring something which is unknown, but acquiring that which is unknown to them, but that which will be beneficial in the future.
So do you think that within the current secular education system, there are a lot of things which are part of that unnecessary knowledge?
Indeed. That's why even in the art traditions which say, acquire knowledge that is beneficial to you, not that which is of no use. And of course, then we have a lot of Quranic ayats which talk about the waste of time.
What would you consider as a waste of time within modern secular education?
You see, in secular education, in fact, even in sometimes people of Muslim Islamic denominations take up the want to study something which does not in actual fact benefit their society, their community. Like for example, some forms of art, for example, other than it being offensive and abusive, there's no benefit to it. What do you want to do with photographing bodies which are of no use for you to be photographing and creating facade in the community? So this is that ilm which is of no use.
Okay, that's an interesting take, because the creativity element, otherwise some would argue that art would be something which nurtures the creative intellect rather than the academic intellect. But you have an argument that's
but
your
you see,
stance.
in that sense that yes, it is creative, but then one doesn't have to be creative on the back of something which is going to create a corruption. Creativity should be that which enables others to create further. not diverge in something which would create obscenity and bewilderness as to what to do next after having that bit of enjoyment from that creativity.
So it's very much an ethical issue that,
of course,
any education you feel that's being given out must have some sort of ethical basis. Okay, I mean, I don't want to divert the question away totally into this this line. I think that's a whole debate for perhaps another time as well. But coming back to methodologies, the methodology that's employed within the secular education system all too often is a very academic and intellectually based one. You were going to allude to prophetic traditions, and the prophetic traditions from the Abrahamic faiths perspectives, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in particular. Would you say there's a particular methodology that you can discern very clearly, bearing in mind Surah Jummah, which I think was where you were going to refer most of your argument from?
You see, again, we have come out from that discussion, but it does lean back that wherever the prophets have made any form of guidance, they have taken that responsibility to be one of moving the community from a loss to a benefit. You know, and so for example, in Ayatul Kursi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. He's the wali of the believers. Allah waliyul ladhina amanu. Yukhriju min adh-dhulumati ila an-nur. That he takes mankind, takes out the believers from darkness to from the wilderness to the light. This is all those meanings of wilderness to the light, in other words, ignorance to awareness. You know, everything is striving towards making sure that that aspect of ignorance, which is a confusion, is eradicated, and that element of awareness, which is a enlightenment, is brought into play. And that's always been the process of all the prophets from beginning to the Khatam, to the last prophet. It's been the case that they have strived towards making sure that the confusion of belief is removed. Once that is removed, then all aspects of want to learn takes in place. Because at the point of confusion of belief, because you see the ayah that we wanted to work with is Surah Jummah, which is the 62nd surah of the Quran, and ayat number 2, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts by saying, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولٌ مِّنْهُمْ. Yeah, which says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He who has raised amongst the inhabitants of Makkah an apostle from amongst them. Now this whole ayat, the initiation of this ayat is very important. The ayat says, it is He who has raised amongst the inhabitants of Makkah a prophet from amongst them. That minhum is a very important statement.
So this idea that the prophet who rises has to have an identity which is very closely linked to the environment in which he's going to preach is very, very important.
Indeed. I mean, the prophet or the apostles who we are really messengers, as we all know, and the messenger is the teacher. Why is it a teacher appointed by God? Because in all the beliefs of the scriptural religions is that the prophet is an embodiment of God's message. In other words, God cannot come physically down to say, I want to teach you something. Yeah? So he has to have the prophet as the tool by which his message is brought to people. In other words, the prophet becomes the teacher on behalf of he who is employing the teacher. So he who is employing the teacher has already set down the principle that he will find a teacher to teach people, not from here and there, but from amongst themselves. So the system that God has identified for a teacher is not that if you've got a system that you want to create, which is an educational system, that you bring people from anywhere you like. No, the teacher must be from amongst those who are learning in that area. In other words, what this ayat is trying to say from the word minhum is that when the teacher comes into the system to teach, the receivers of that knowledge know that he's from us. So they're quite comfortable with this fact that because he's from us, he will know what our problems are. Not someone coming from 4 oceans across and coming to say, I want to teach you. Yeah, because the person is not that familiar with what the issues are at hand. And the people there don't really respect him because he's an alien. So this is eliminated. The teacher, the employer of the teachers, in other words, God, has said, I'm going to create a system where I want my message to be taught, but I will not have a teacher teaching it who doesn't know the people to whom he's teaching. I mean, that's a dilemma which we're here face to face non-stop in England, particularly with the new generation of our community, where there's so much, where they require so much assistance from ulema, from scholars, who are aware of the problems that they're face to face with. But saddened as we are, we get scholars who are, as I said, 4 oceans away. I mean, who come from 4 oceans away, and they don't really know what the issues are. So that's a very important identity of a teacher that the Almighty has already defined.
I think you've opened up a very, very interesting area. It's one of the common debates that I guess the first generation of Muslims arriving in this country face. There is a linguistic change. Young people are understanding English. They're losing the mother tongues, wherever they may come from. And it almost seems inexorable fact of life that English is going to become the main medium and the methodology. So therefore, again, referring to the Quranic ayat, finding the teachers who are from within your actual social setting where you are sounds like good practice, sounds like good sense, and certainly from a Quranic perspective, an imperative.
Indeed it is. I mean, there are certain elements of which kind of exclusion clause to this. And this is what we, in our communities, particularly those who understand the meaning of marjiyat and ijtihad, that they're kind of confused on this thing that, how can we follow marjiyat taqleed who's sitting 4,000 miles away? We must have an English-speaking marjiyat taqleed, for example. This is a wrong interpretation of this situation. Why? Because when you have a medical problem, for example, you can phone a doctor all the way in Sydney, and get a solution to your problem. It's not because he understands English. It's because he understands the causes of your ailment. In other words, he knows the principles by which your ailment can be remedied. So it doesn't matter if the marjiyat taqleed is sitting in Qom or in Najaf. He knows he knows the problems of your ailment. He knows the principles of your ailment. He can provide you the remedy. So it's not an issue that the marjiyat taqleed must sit in our armpit to get answers from him. But when it comes to the actual teacher, he who is one-to-one contact, there it is essential and paramount that the teacher who is at hand to the recipient knows the language and the lingo and the system by which he is to be teaching.
Okay, that's fascinating, because I think this is again coming onto practical issues which we Muslims in the West face very regularly, and you very bravely raised this issue of marjiyat taqleed. Quite often, is the office of marjiyat taqleed limited partly by the information and the evidence that people send?
It is purely I mean, you
is that not where there might be a problem?
No, but it's dependent on the question itself. You raise a question with the marjiyat taqleed and say, is football haram? And say, no, football's not haram. Then you say, is football haram? Can football be haram because you can gamble on it? Then the gambling component would make this haram. So it's what you're questioning in other words, what is the subject you're throwing at him to be able to acquire an answer pertaining to it? So that is not the marjiyat taqleed's lack of interpretation. It is your particular way by which you're providing that question to.
I often think that cultural nuances or psychological nuances, emotional nuances that differ between, say, places like Najaf and places like Qom and London, they're considerable. How much of a factor do you think those cultural, psychological, social factors would play in terms of the decision made by a marjiyat taqleed? If he was here, he would understand those cultural factors. Do you think those have an impact?
This is again, that's what I'm trying to touch at when I gave you the example. Scholars of that caliber are taught the principles by which certain issues can be remedied. Consequently, it's not the subject. It's being aware of the ailment. They become familiar of the ailment and therefore know the remedy to that ailment. Now, if someone comes up and says, I've got this issue, my arms are scratching this way, that way, because you know the ailment, you can give the medicine. This is what the marjiyat taqleed is. He knows the remedies to a generic ailment.
So you're saying that there are commonalities in these ailments. The source or the root cause of these ailments is probably the same.
You see, even in the Quran, if you look at the Quran is most of its explanation is generic. It says, for example, and this is where a lot of our people have a problem, it says, establish salat. Technically, you could stand on your heads, put your legs up in the air, say, I'm doing prayers. Because it says establish prayers. It's giving you a generic statement. It's not saying how to do it.
The methodology is.
The methodology is in the hands of he who is able to explain how to have a remedy to that inquiry of establishing prayers.
Well, I think this, I mean, I have gone quite sort of hardline on the Majlis Taqlid issue of how they discern the methodology of educating the society over everyday problems. Let's move on to often people who just make their own rules up as they go along. For instance, there are many, many people who acquire the titles of sheikh from all sorts of the various madhabs of the Islamic faith. How does the community deal with that, where people say, well, okay, I'm not willing to listen to the established institutions or the established ways of discerning right from wrong or the Sharia itself, and I can interpret the Quran myself, and I can interpret hadith myself. I speak Arabic, I read Arabic, so I can do it all myself. What do you say in that scenario?
You see, to know Arabic is not a one and all thing, because the Quran was revealed in Arabic. Yet still it needed a mufassir, a commentator. Who was the commentator? The Holy Prophet. In others, the revelations, knowing a language to an effect of a particular understanding is not sufficient. In others, one has to have the assistance of he who can explain it. You pick up all the A-level biology books and sit at home and say, I want to prepare for my A-levels. You can't go through it unless you have a teacher explaining you the depth of the biological explanations which are embedded in those books. This is the same thing with the Quran. That's why Mawla Ali said, I'm the Quran and Natiq, for example. I'm the explanation. I'm the logic of that book, which we'll talk about later on, because the hikmah is the last bit of this ayat. Yeah. So in reality, the learning of it, the hikmah, which we will talk about, comes here a little bit in what you're saying. That one who extrapolates on a particular load of information, he not necessarily has the benefit of explanation, because there's a deeper hikmah in the learning process, which is lost in this individual, because it's burnt by that concept which threw shaitan out from in front of Allah's audience, and that was takabbur. The person saying, I know it all, he's in a state of takabbur, because there's no one. Even, for example, when Imam Khomeini was passing away, he says, I'm still a Ahlebait ilm. So, that arrogance that I know it all burns all that which one knows.
What are the practical dangers of that know-it-all?
Well, the practical dangers are that because you think you know it all, those who are weaker than you assume that you do know it all. And thereupon, or those who have some shaitanic desires to have some clown sitting in front of them, they would pump you more, saying, yeah, you know it. And thereupon, you get elevated and stage a coup d'etat for yourself. And thereupon you become so embedded in this thought that you know it all that you start in fact condemning those who do know it.
Well, you've highlighted some really practical issues about the learned and the knowledgeable and those who can interpret Quran, the importance of the commentator, the quality of the commentator, the integrity of the commentator. I mean, all these issues, again, can be dealt with in more detail. But I think, again, just as a mapping exercise, you've covered the first part of Surah Jummah.
Ayat number 2.
Ayat number 2. Can we move on to the next methodology that you picked up from there?
Then it says, Yatlu alayhim ayat. The next part of the ayat says, Yatlu alayhim ayat. That means to recite to them the communications. In other words, ayat really means signs. A tree is a sign of God. That's why we use the word ayatullah. In other words, the signs of God, the ulama that we have of a very high caliber, they consider the signs of God. In others, inshallah, they're the people who, in the absence of the 12th Imam, are conveying to people that message which otherwise the 12th Imam would give directly himself, is using the auspices of Majlis Taqlid or ulama of learned levels to provide that message. In others, that explanation of the signs of the Creator. In other words, that first part of the ayat is saying, Yatlu alayhim ayat. In other words, the responsibility of the teacher is to communicate to the recipient not the performance, but those things which would encourage the person to perform once he knows for whom he is performing. Yeah? In other words, the signs of God. You say, this tree is created by whom? Who is the creator? Unless the person, like for example, stones. In those time of the Jahiliyyah, they were worshipping stones. But little did they realize that they were worshipping a thing which has been created. So what the Holy Prophet made them alert or aware of was the fact that this very stone, which has been created by something, you're using it as your own creator. So that's a sign, not actually telling him to worship God, but bringing the signs of understanding.
So it's looking at nature, it's looking at realities around you,
Exactly.
looking perhaps even at human behavior, analyzing your life experience.
Indeed, what this ayat is saying in the process of the learning process is that once an individual has been selected from amongst the people, first step he has to undertake is to make people familiar of God's creations. Before he becomes familiar, when we talked about the beneficial knowledge and the non-beneficial knowledge, he sees that knowledge which he is acquiring is the knowledge which would be fruitful in acquiring God's satisfaction.
But it also strikes me that when you talk about the signs and your interpretation of the signs of God was very much about nature, that seemed quite scientific to me.
Indeed, because you see, there's always a conflict between scientists and worshippers. You know, the earlier confrontation between Darwin and the church was on the basis of him being a biologist, telling theologians that you're wasting your time in trying to interpret creation and the Genesis and everything. He said, I know the meaning of Genesis. It's a line of evolutionary stages. That's it. That's the process of it. So, you know, the whole technique of teaching is first making people familiar. You know, there's a lovely joke where a teacher says to I'm allowed to say small jokes on this.
Yeah, I think so. I think
where the teacher says to Mark, he says, Mark, can you see the tree from the window? He says, yes, sir, I can see the tree. Then he says, can you see the birds on the tree? He says, yes, I can see birds on the tree. Then he says, can you see the sky? So Mark says, yes, I can see the sky. Then the teacher says, well, can you see God? So the boy says, no, I can't see God. So he said, because you can't see God, he doesn't exist. So there was a religious child there. He says to Mark, Mark, can you see Sir's table? He says, yes. He says, Mark, can you see Sir standing? He says, yes, I can. Then he says, Mark, can you see Sir's head? He says, yes. Then he says, Mark, can you see Sir's brain? He says, no. So he says, no, okay, then Sir doesn't have a brain. So it's clear that which is not seen does not mean it doesn't exist. This is what the ayat is trying to, yatlu alayhim ayat, is making people familiar of the fact that which you do not see does not mean it does not exist.
But again, it's also perhaps inspiring empirical research, logical, methodical research of the signs of God.
Indeed.
It's very important. And to some extent, the Muslims we're beginning to relearn it, but it seems at some stage we seem to have lost touch with the sciences.
Well, you see, because of the very fact that greed and conceited attitudes by politicians of our historical times, where they sold the religion for their betterment, where they actually destroyed the want for knowledge. I mean, there's a lovely saying which Imam Khomeini says in his stand against Shah, when Shah's patronizing him. He says, where's your army? Imam Khomeini says, my army is in the laps of its mothers. In other words, the want of education was removed from our communities. A friend of mine, a good colleague of mine, he says, when the British Empire was leaving Pakistan, they actually advised some of the landowners the only way they can control Pakistan is by making sure that education does not come into their areas. In other words, keeping the community subdued and subservient to a ignorant authority. And that's why when the first stage that the Nabi is instructed to do, he's not trying to say mankind should be ignorant, should be subservient to an ignorant authority. In fact, he's explaining the signs of the Creator so that they become knowledgeable, to which they should be subservient to.
So we've got a quality of commentator who's perfect, and he has to be conversant with his environment.
Yeah.
The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was clearly sent with a message for the entire universes, and perhaps parallel universes and other existences that we don't know about, the worlds. So it's interesting that the Arabic language is, in a sense, confined to the Arab people, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his time, seems to converse largely only with the Arabic population, although he does send messages to the Byzantines and to the Persians, etc. But primarily his period of prophetic period deals with the Arab peoples, and the Quran, Holy Quran, is in Arabic. But yet the Quran is intended to be universal. I'll come back to how then in the wake of the prophetic methodology or mission, how that message could remain intact, given that it spreads through the entire, world, and how does it adapt to that is a big issue. But anyway, sticking to the third aspect of the ayats.
Well, the second system, because the first thing is God's system, that the selection of the teacher is in he who is employing the teacher. And we said God is the employer of the teacher, he's the messenger. So he selected one who knew where he was going, and he was from that group of people. By being from that group of people, you made a very important point, is that because he was from that people, he could give the signs which were familiar to those people in that community, which is very important. For had he come from another community, he would be explaining something else. So that was very important, that because he's from there, the signs that he had to explore, obviously there were God's revelations to him, but how do you articulate them? So that's very important. So that articulation system is that first stage, that yatlu alayhim ayat. Then it doesn't stop there. Then the ayat says, yatlu alayhim ayat wa yuzakkihim. Then you purify them. Now this is very important. Unlike the extremist system, where extremists in our community, they don't look at the purification, they look at the immediate practicality performance. In other words, they don't teach you how to clean out the weaknesses in yourself. What they do is they say, okay, you've seen the God, you've seen the signs of God, you've acknowledged that God exists, come and pray with me. This system which God is defining does not compel people to immediately to come and pray, particularly those who do not know Islam. In other words, those who want to become familiar with Islam, or even a child, when the child is growing, when we as Muslims, when we raise our children, the period of bulugh, up to the time of bulugh, is in fact that period of yatlu alayhim ayat wa yuzakkihim.
Can you translate that?
Yatlu alayhim ayat, in other words, explain them the communications and then purify them. So the periods of up to the age of bulugh, in other words, maturity, Islam is not telling the child, because the child has no responsibility, but the parents have the duty to make sure that they purify their kids, so when the child does become baligh, he or she can immediately pray.
What is that? What is the education entailed in purification?
Well, you see, in purification, of course, one starts eradicating all those unwanted desires. And you may think, okay, a child, what do you mean by a child? You see, a child is also learning things from the outset. I mean, there are a lot of traditions which say, when a child a child starts, when you can see a child experiencing things from your actions, that immediately you should put the child in the room next door as mom and dad. So that experiencing process which mom and dad, the relationship that mom and dad have, it should not even be seen by a child of 2 years, 3 years, because they're experiencing the relationships with themselves.
So it's got to be at the right time.
Exactly.
Not before they're ready for it.
So the purification. And there are a lot of reports coming out nowadays that, for example, some of these hygiene classes that schools have at the moment, they activate children towards relationships prior to their ages concern. I mean, we've just had a recent report.
Pornography and there are reports to say that 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds.
Consequently, it's teaching at the wrong time, and rather than purifying, corrupting. So what Islam says, that you train the child who's 16 years old, 15, about to turn 15. Yes, you are a physically changed person, but your physical change does not mean that you direct yourself towards corruptive acts. You direct yourself towards restraint, you direct yourself towards obedience, you direct yourself towards dua, you direct yourself towards fasting, all those purifications.
So this is the purification methodology, fasting and all the actual rukn.
It's not kind of what some of our people think, that you got to have a taviz written for the child, so then no, everything is there in the Quran, everything's there in practical lives of our scholars.
After purification, what's the next indication?
You see, so this ayat says yatlu alayhim ayat wa yuzakkihim wa yu'allimuhumul kitaba wal hikmah. Then it starts saying, then you teach the people the book and its wisdom. In other words, once you've got the person seeing the signs of the Creator, or I know there must be something which has created them. So he says to himself, okay, I know something created them, so I must have been also created by that. So I've now got to make sure, how do I get close to that individual? Okay, so I have to start removing all those corrupt factors in my existence. That's yuzakihim, the purification. Now that I've removed all this corruption, now I want to learn how to then really and truly become obedient to this entity, which has created me, enabled me to eradicate all that facade in me. So then the teacher's work comes in now, after he's purified the soul, that he starts explaining to the people what the book is talking about. The book is saying you must fast. The book is saying you must pray. The book is saying you must go on Hajj. In other words, those duties, you must pay khums, you must pay zakat, all those aspects of a practical life is then being taught. You're not explaining why at that stage, not even as a teacher. You're giving the theories. You know, there are two very interesting schools in education, the behavioralists and the constructivists. The behavioralist theory says you must spoon feed the child everything, the student, he doesn't know anything. The constructivists say that you become a facilitator of knowledge. Islam has both these processes. In the sense, the first stage where yatlu alayhim ayat, the first stage of yatlu alayhim ayat wa yuzakkihim yu'allimuhumul kitaba, that first stage of the teaching process of the book is actually just indoctrination. The wisdom state is where the facilitation comes in. In other words, you start telling the person you must pray, you must fast. You don't tell them why you must pray at that stage when the person is becoming familiar in this process. You just give them the theories of understanding.
The wisdom state. Wisdom, on the one hand, is the outer wisdom, the Sharia. Is there a deeper wisdom that we're referring to as well? And how do you access that deeper wisdom? Perhaps?
You see, the whole meaning of wisdom is the realization of performing something which is beneficial to acquire God's satisfaction. That is the depth of wisdom. You know, you do things in a manner such that he to whom you have to answer back is satisfied with you. You won't do something which is going to reciprocate danger for you. So a wise person is he who understands what the ayats are, understands his cleanliness has been as a result of his obedience to the Creator, takes on a route of understanding the book in such a manner that it is a wise way of implementing it. You know, there's a lovely saying from Shaykh Arif Hussain Hussaini. He says the difference between a religious politician and a non-religious politician is that the religious politician rotates his politics around his religion, whilst the non-religious politician rotates his religion around his politics. And that's what a wise person is. A wise person is he that he wants to do something, he goes back to the book and says, is this endorsable by the book? If not, I will leave it. That's a wise way of approaching it. Rather than, I want to do something, let me get a seal of approval from the book. That's an unwise way of doing it.
Your final word on the verse itself, a conclusion.
Yeah, the conclusion is that, alhamdulillah, when we go deep into the Quran, we find the theories of performance which are applicable in this day and age, but because we don't know it, we're not looking at the Islamic ways of education, but we're leaning on purely secular tools of education. Where really and truly, when we examine the Quran, we examine the traditions of the Ahlebait, we'll find that all these techniques of teaching are there in our hands. We've just not articulated them to our application and performance.
And just finally, a thought that I'm having. You've got the interfaith scene. Everything you've said in the verse there from the Holy Quran would resonate with Judaic and Christian traditions.
Indeed it would. I mean, look at the prophets who came. I mean, you had, for example, Hazrat Musa. You know, he was fostered by by Pharaoh. But where did the Almighty send Hazrat Musa to? To his own people. The minhum is there. And where Hazrat Isa comes up, gets born underneath a tree, Hazrat Maryam and everything. Where does he go first stage to do his teaching? Galilee. Consequently, is minhum there. You know, so in reality, God from the outset sends the prophet. That's why we have a tradition from Imam Jafar Sadiq al-Islam, I think, if I'm not wrong, that he quite clearly says the prophets have been sent to their communities. You know, we have prophets. You know, we may not know ex-prophet is somewhere or somebody known to be the guide in that period, in a particular area that we don't know anything about. And you know, really and truly, as we've got in our understanding, that Islam has the two meanings to prophethood: one, a prophet which is a Nabi, and a prophet who's a Rasul. The Rasul is he who's been given a Risalat. The Nabi is he who continues the implementation of the last Rasul's message.
Risalah for those
Risalat, in other words, the scriptural rules and regulations. The revelations in reality. So Rasul is he who has been given the revelation. In other words, he's given the responsibility to create a rule on behalf of God's commands. Whilst the Nabi, the Anbiya, are those who execute it on behalf of the Rasul to whom they associate to, until the next Rasul comes.
Well, Maulana, thank you very much for a very interesting and very fascinating dissection of the Quranic verse, Surah Jummah, verse 2, I believe.
Verse 2, chapter 62.
Worth going and having a little read of that verse and analysing in detail its impact and its kind of consequences for Islamic education, secular education, and perhaps education from an interfaith Abrahamic perspective as well. Hugely relevant and a really great example of how the universalism of Islam can still encapsulate all societies, all civilizations. On that note, I'd like to beg your leave. Assalamu alaikum. Until the next edition of Faith to Faith, take care.